Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Literati, for the support. I've been trapped in a hotel room for about a week now, and it's just a real joy to see other people's faces and other people's names. I am going to read from the very beginning of my novel, Agatha of Little Neon. Obviously, since it's the first couple of pages, there aren't really any spoilers, and there aren't really any plot events that you have to know about. But this first couple pages sets up the book well. Okay. Mother Roberta made the rules. No chewing gum, no bicycles, no tree nuts, no pets. Every morning she brewed the coffee, and every night she cooked the meal. Twice a year, she sewed our maid to measure habits from yards of a black poly wool blend. She embroidered pillows, made punch from powder, wrote the homilies for the priest. When Father Thaddeus came to Lackawanna, he suggested she might take a break, relax. She was 81, frail as filament, and had started having bad days. Lapses in memory, slips in the shower. She sometimes peed herself. Twice in 1 month, we'd had to rummage through bags of trash in search of her false teeth. Mother Roberta acquiesced. She would try to relax. She began to spend her days behind a newspaper held wide, or at the kitchen table with a cup of red rose tea, staring at a spread of puzzle pieces that she never seemed to touch. But while we weren't looking, she put all 1,000 pieces where they were meant to be, and one afternoon the puzzle was finished. A moonscape. She left it on the table until dinner, then wrecked it and started again. Everything we knew about living, we knew because Mother Roberta had showed us. She taught us to be busy, write our representatives, make bread of brown bananas. There's no time for nothing, she used to tell us when she caught us staring out the window or flipping through stations on the rectory radio. Mother Roberta had 3 stiff hairs on her chin that we could only spot when she sat underneath the kitchen light. We used to fight each other for the chance to lean close and tug them loose. The thrill of it. We were eager, and she obliged, knowing she was too blind to get them herself. One of us would crouch and raise a pair of tweezers, and when a hair was plucked free, present it in front of Mother Roberta's face, so she could close her eyes, make a wish, and blow. It seemed impossible then, in the time before Little Neon and Woonsocket, to imagine chin hairs of our own. The 4 of us were born in different months of the same year, each of us 20 when we became novitiates, 22 when we made our vows. We were 29 when we moved from Lackawanna, just south of Buffalo, to Woonsocket. Back then, our chins were bald, our minds sharp. Our faith was firm and founded. We were fixed to one another, like parts of some strange asymmetrical body. Frances was the mouth, Mary Lucille the heart, Therese the legs, and I, Agatha, the eyes. There were a lot of parts missing, I suppose, but for a while we didn't realize it. For a while it seemed like enough. When I was young, I thought womanhood would bring autonomy, glamour, fur coats and fat wallets, days entirely of my design. I planned as a girl to become the kind of woman who kept a pen in her breast pocket. It seemed important that when I grew up, I always had my own pen, that I never had to borrow anything from anyone else. Now that I'm on my own, the thing I miss most is time spent in a parked van with my sisters, waiting for one of us to root through her bag and find whatever it was the other needed the most. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It was wonderful. I love the opening, and I think it does such a good job of displaying what makes your writing so special. Let's see. I just want to say it's really a thrill to get to do this with you, Claire. Congratulations on your book and the amazing reception it's gotten.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll tell the audience that I first met Claire when they were a student in my MFA workshop that I was teaching at the University of Oregon, where I still teach. And it's just been such a sort of extra thrill then to watch you go through the publication process for your book to come in the world, be in the world, and to be so wonderfully received. So congratulations again. I heard you on NPR as I was driving the other day, and it was just a lovely, I didn't know it was coming. It was just this lovely moment to hear your voice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been so wonderful to hear from people who listen to NPR, because I had kind of thought that no one listened to NPR or they only listened to it accidentally. And yeah, it's been wonderful just to hear from people that had not only heard my voice, but also listened to NPR regularly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was great. It was great. And it was just exciting to hear you in that, in that format. So let's see, I wonder if we should start. I sort of wanted to start. I mean, the opening does definitely set up the book really well, as you said, but I wonder if we could dig just a little more into Agatha at the start. I would love to hear how would you describe her and sort of where she finds herself at the start of the book?
Right. At the start of the book, because it's a retrospective story, we both know where she is narrating the book, but we also go with her back to the beginning of the story. So at the beginning of the book, she's very much part of this group of sisters that she's been with for 9 years, and she, no longer is with them, which we learn very soon into the book, at the 9th paragraph or something like that. But we, are able to feel, or we're able to see what it was like for Agatha to find herself in a place of belonging, in a place of mutual love and support with her other sisters. And that's what I tried to establish at the beginning of the book, was just this sense that, there was a time when Agatha felt part of something and felt close to these other women. So that's what I was trying to establish there. And in comparing the women to body parts of the same, different parts of the same body, that's one of the things that I was trying to drive home with that metaphor, was that they had found ways to work together. They had found rhythms and ways of treating each other that worked for them for a while. But ultimately, as I give away, it isn't enough to keep them together.
Right. Yeah, you do it so efficiently there. I think establish that feeling. So the other thing that I'm just curious about as a sort of early starting point is, I would love to just know, what was the initial kernel of the book? What was, if you remember, what was the first section you wrote? Did you always realize it was going to be a novel? Was it just a little flash, a voice? Was it Agatha the character? How did it start?
Yeah, it started with voice and language. I was, which is how it usually starts for me. It's never any lofty plot or big conceit, but usually I hear a little bit of language, or I come up with a little bit of language that gets me invested. So for me, it was this idea of, it's a refrain in the book. It was our belief that everything could become something else. That was the first line that came to me. And I, I had this chorus in mind before I had any individual characters. And so I was narrating from the first person plural for a while, and writing just very small pieces, very small fragments of stories. And then I would try to piece them together later. And then when I had, multiple stories, then the work became piecing those together in such a way that there was, connective tissue, and everything felt part of the same whole. So it was a very fractured process, I would say. I like to say that the way I write is also the way I text people. I'm always texting people 2 words at a time, 3 emojis, and then half a sentence, and then the rest of the sentence. So it's a very inefficient way to do it, but that's kind of how my brain operates, is like piecemeal work. And then I kind of like, make sense of it later.
And was Agatha always like, was she the center always of those stories, or not necessarily, like as you wrote the fragments?
Yeah, I didn't really have Agatha in the stories or in the world. She wasn't a part of how I conceived of these stories until much later.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was more like the collective voice that I was interested in. And then it was later in the process that I had to like, start to identify who was in this group, like who is actually part of this collective.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, sorry, to go on if you.
No, at the beginning I was, imagining that there were like hundreds of nuns narrating this at the same time. And I know you and I read The Buddha in the Attic together, and that was a really important book for me in terms of thinking about like what first person plural point of view can do, and the different ways that it can look on the page.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great. So in that sense, if it was hundreds, then in that sense, it sort of would be like an impossible perspective. But then it seems like you sort of, for this project, narrowed it down. I mean, impossible in a really, moving and beautiful way. But it seems like
Right.
you, in the end, somewhere along the way, chose to make it a more like
Yes.
narrow and in a way real.
Right. Yeah, by eliminating like hundreds and hundreds of nuns from the narrative, it became much more manageable.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I was going to ask you. There was just this quote in the really wonderful New York Times book review of your book, that there's this one description that sort of jumped out at me, and I just was wondering. It feels like it fits with what you're saying now. I'm curious to hear what you think just of this characterization. It's when it's talking about the sisters and how they are sort of this like unit, and it says, quote, "If feelings of envy or apprehension crop up, they snip them away quickly and serenely with prayer, forever dissolving themselves in a spiritual anonymity akin to erasure." And I was just interested in what you like. Did you feel like, does that resonate with you, that description, that anonymity akin to erasure? Like, did you, and to what extent do you feel like that is sort of, part of what you're trying to do in the book?
Right. Yeah. It's been such a funny experience reading reviews, because I feel like I have the kind of mind that spins like any observation into like potential criticism. So I was like, akin to erasure, like I shouldn't have erased them.
Oh, no. No, and also, by the way, even as I was introducing it, I felt like I was probably making you nervous. I don't think I've ever like, I wouldn't normally be like, well, what do you think of this review? How about this other review? But I just feel like that particular phrasing was so interesting to me. And I feel like it does maybe get at something. And I don't think it's a criticism. I think it's like getting at something that's going on.
Right. Yeah. Actually, my partner was talking to me about that, and he was like, it's incredible that this person was able to see like the former drafts of the book, like a little bit of the ghost of the we voice in that observation. So I really appreciated that. And yeah, I when I look back at the book, because it's kind of been a long time since I've read it,
Right.
but when I look back at it, there are sections where you can kind of feel the characters like ignoring their own inclinations or their own desires in order to like, keep an even keel in the group, and keep things like, positive and moving along.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw that. Yeah, that was something that I noticed in the book that was really interesting, and not something I'd thought about related to women in this circumstance. Like the appeal, it seems like, and then ultimate, maybe limitations. I mean, for sure limitations, but the kind of appeal of that for a while for Agatha,
Right.
to hide herself. And that's what I think I was big to me, that anonymity that's like a type of erasure for a while. It was like, I get the feeling as a reader that it like that was part of the appeal.
Yes.
If you imagine.
Yeah. And I think for so long, the life of a woman religious was one of very few options that women had to pursue higher education or to pursue a life that didn't involve marriage and becoming a mother. And so I think if I had set the book like a couple decades earlier, that would have been, one of the reasons for these women to become or to like devote their lives to the church. But for Agatha, because she's a little bit younger and came of age at a different time, that idea of hiding oneself, at least for me, seemed very appealing and seemed like something that I could imagine this character seeking out in a world, especially because she loses her mother when she's young and is kind of unmoored by that. Yeah, I think the church is like a really appealing anchor for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you ever think about setting it in a different time? Because I agree, it have a really different. I mean, some things would be similar, but I think particularly the person who chooses to join in 2000, or let's see, I've lost track of what the time. I know it mentioned 2005, but maybe that's 9 years after. Anyway, in the 90s,
Right.
it feels like that's a different choice in the 90s than it would be in the 1950s or something. So, did you explore those other possibilities?
I didn't. I think I have a hard time writing about time periods that like I haven't lived through myself. There's just so many questions, like how did they know where that restaurant was, or like how did they get their prescriptions, how did like what kinds of things. I get caught up in like making it realistic and like adhering to logic and truth. So for me, yeah, I don't know if you have a different experience with writing outside the time periods that you've been alive.
No, I find I have 100% the same experience.
Yeah, right.
Like all my energy would be lost in those questions. Yeah, especially not important. It's not important to the story maybe, but it is important to the reality of the scene. Like I admire people who write fiction set in the past because of that. Just getting all those little tiny details right.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what did they eat in the 12th century? Like, and how did they eat it? Right? Did they have teeth? Like,
yeah.
Important questions.
Right. Or like, how did they travel from one place to another? Or anyway, yeah.
Right.
Or how would this particular class of person have done a certain thing? Yeah. Anyway.
Exactly.
So, but I do feel like maybe that's something that makes this book feel sort of fresh and like something I haven't read before, that these are, near contemporary women religious, which I feel like I don't feel like we have heard a lot of mainstream stories about. Like in a way, I think people, at least Americans, kind of associate, especially young women, choosing this route. I think we kind of associate it with an earlier time. So I think it's interesting, that you've devoted the book to this. And I wonder, it makes me wonder also sort of to what extent you did research into that and women who have made that.
Yeah, it's such a rare choice and it's becoming rarer and rarer. I was really interested in the research process, in talking to older women who were part of the church and had been for decades. And then a friend of a friend who was my age, and like I had gone to parties with her. I had gotten to like she went to Princeton. She's a very smart, very bright young woman, and I remember feeling like an immediate wave of judgment when I heard that she was considering professing vows, and I like had to really sit with that reaction that I had. And then I ended up talking to her in the research process for this book, and it just is like, it's unthinkable to me, this lifestyle. And that I think is what made it a really good topic for a novel, because I think novelists have to like figure something out over the process of the book. They should constantly be like solving both big and small questions. And for me, that big question was like, why? Like, I just couldn't wrap my head around, kind of giving your years away, especially to an institution that at the time, and still now, of course, has fallen short of what my generation has come to, expect or demand of the world. So yeah, that was one of the things I was trying to figure out in the writing of this book, was like, what is still there in the church for young people who, are able to see injustice and like failed institutions, but aren't able to fix them.
Mm-hmm. And did you feel like, I love that formulation, by the way, of, that novelists are sort of trying to answer these questions, or should be, that's part of the process. Did you feel like you came to an understanding over the course of it, at least for Agatha, maybe?
Yeah, I think for Agatha, definitely. That idea of like, I certainly have spent many years trying to find, like ways to be in the world, right? Like ways to solve myself for a little bit of time, like a certain job or a city or a relationship.
Mm.
And I think that's true for Agatha as well.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way as a reader. I guess that leads me to another question that I have, which is, my understanding is you went to Catholic school. Is that right? I'm not sure sort of how like religious your upbringing was, or whether you want to speak to that. But I just was curious, sort of how does your own experience with Catholicism, or or at least Catholic school, like how did that inform the writing process or your decision to write about it? And what kind of challenges came with that? Or did you have misgivings? Just anything that you might be interested in saying about that.
Yeah, I grew up super Catholic. Like I did all the things that little Catholics are supposed to do. I, had a first communion. I, at age 9, confessed to all my horrible sins. And that was like a really important part of my life and had been for so long. But then once I went to college, it kind of like evaporated. It just vanished. Maybe because I didn't have to, pursue church and pursue, like, living Catholically. And so, yeah, another thing that I was trying to figure out in writing this book was like, what happened to all that? Like, you used to, eat the Eucharist every week, and consider it, Jesus's body. So a lot of what I was trying to do in writing this book was like figure out my own loss of faith. Agatha doesn't really lose her faith over the course of the book. And that to me was important because I feel like I've read so many loss of faith stories. But in putting Agatha in these situations, in like watching her in church and seeing what happens when she, comes up against a ugly priest, not physically ugly, but morally ugly. A good-looking priest who has a bad heart. But in seeing how she responded to those types of situations, I was able to like, sit with my own kind of mystery of faith and my relationship to the church. I was raised super Catholic, but I was also raised by really liberal people who, like I grew up in Cincinnati, and it's a very conservative church in a very conservative suburb that I grew up in. And I was always kind of raised with these twin ideals of like loving God and, deferring your will to God, but also like loving other people and seeking justice and seeking fairness. And so both of those things were important to me in writing this book. I didn't want to write a very conservative book. I didn't want to write a very liberal book, but I wanted to write a book that, shed light on whether or not there's space for growth and change and equality in this church.
Were there ever moments where that felt uncomfortable, or that you had, like, I don't know, worries about like what your former Catholic community would think, or was it at this point so distant that you felt?
Yeah, it was pretty distant. I did worry, like, I was a little bit worried about like my Catholic high school. So I was very attached to this one nun who hated me, but I really loved her, or like, was kind of fixated with her. She taught me macroeconomics, and I was worried that she would, see this book and like, I don't know, respond in some way that hurt my feelings. But besides that, I don't really have many very religious friends. A lot of my family too has kind of grown away from the church in recent years. And I think for a variety of reasons, but that's made it a lot easier to talk about the book with them.
Well, I'm glad it wasn't a source of that part of it wasn't a source of
right.
So let's see, something that I particularly love about this book, and that I always have about your writing, is the way that you illuminate the meaning of these kind of small moments of everyday experience. Like, there's just so much texture to your writing, but also like emotional texture built in, and often in these really kind of mundane moments. And I think it's really beautiful. And this section that you read at the beginning, you have that line, which I wrote down for myself to quote here. Now that I'm on my own, the thing I miss most is time spent in a parked van with sisters, waiting for one of us to root through her bag and find whatever it was the other needed most. And I just love that line, because in a way, it's a memory of just a literal thing happening, of someone of waiting for one another in a van. I feel like they're so often in a van. It feels that's kind of what I'm saying. Like an example of the texture of reality that you capture so wonderfully. But in that moment and so many others, it's like we get the texture of everyday granular experience, but also kind of suffused with a tenderness and emotion at the same time, but not in an over the top way. Like, it feels really earned and real, and it's just a lovely quality in your writing, and in this book in particular. And I think that attention, I feel like it sort of extends to the characters too, that sort of attention to the everyday people in a way. And I'm especially thinking of the residents of the halfway house in Rhode Island, like the people who live there, and that you really devote a lot of attention to, even though their lives are sort of limited at this moment in time by their circumstances. It gives so much like depth and meaning and significance to their lives, and I think it's sort of related to that, to your writing style. And I was just curious, how did these characters come to you? What made you decide to include them, or sort of focus on them, and what do they mean to Agatha?
Thank you for saying all those kind things. I think most of the characters came to me in very small ways. I think, like I said, I text people 2 words at a time. That's kind of how I do all of the writing stuff, is like very little pieces of the work. And I feel like a lot of the characters came from small observations or small ideas. Like for Tim Gary, I, started with this idea of someone who had lost his jaw and had to live in the world with like, a disfigured face, a face that other people would find abnormal or distracting. And for some of the other residents, it was very small things like, what if we had someone named Lawnmower Jill, right? Like, what if we had someone who rode a lawnmower everywhere? What if we had, someone who was like a tough exterior, but he went by the name Baby, right? So like little small things like that. And then the character building came from that, from those like small little bits. I'm always trying to like have fun when I'm writing. And for me, having those, like, it's almost like having a personal joke with yourself. Like, what if this woman can only drive a lawnmower? What would happen?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just was like always trying to go a little bit further, like that children's book. If you give a mouse a cookie, like if you give Lawnmower Jill, a sequin dress, like what happens next? Yeah, so I ascribe to the if you give a mouse a cookie school of writing, I guess.
Did you come up with her name first? Because it almost feels like it comes from like another thing that I might ask you about in a moment is just like your attention to language. So the idea that she might have actually grown from her name, the character herself. I don't know.
Yeah, someone I knew was telling me about kind of an iconic figure in a town that they had lived, named Lawnmower Bill. And then it turned out that there were like a lot of people like this, like in small towns across America. There are people that drive lawnmowers, I guess. When I was spending time
like as a means of transportation, you mean?
Right, yeah. When I was spending time on Fisher's Island, I met someone who rode only a lawnmower. And, I kind of felt like I had been writing about him for years. Anyway, so yeah, that's where Lawnmower Jill came from. And I just love the sound of that name and that idea, and then kept going with it.
Great, I love that. I guess we didn't say, do you want to just sort of describe for people who are not familiar, sort of how the halfway house comes into the story, because I don't think that's right in the beginning, like how they end up there.
Yes. So early on in the book, the sisters learn that their diocese has run out of money and the daycare is no longer bringing in any money. And so they are made to leave the city of Buffalo and go somewhere else. And their Mother Superior finds for them work in Rhode Island, where a parish there runs a halfway house for people in recovery and people who are on parole. And so they kind of head there with no real experience, no real training, and live in the house and take care of these people. Agatha also goes to teach at the local high school. Yeah, and that came pretty late in the process of writing. I had
sorry, was it teaching or the
the halfway house, actually, that whole like plot conceit. I had written many drafts of the book, and there was a lot that like still wasn't working. There were things that just didn't make sense, and like things that were hard to believe or trust. Like in earlier drafts, the nuns just like go to live with Tim Gary alone. Which is just like a little bit strange and not something that happens that often. And yeah, when I came up with the halfway house conceit, it solved a lot of those smaller problems that I didn't quite know how to address. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, yeah, everything just kind of fell into place after I solved that bigger conceptual problem.
Great. And then now I want to get back to something that you sort of alluded to, but it was going to be one of my questions is, how do you imagine the role of humor in this book? I mean, humor almost seems to me too loud of a word for what's going on here, but there is this like wonderful wit that kind of flashes throughout the book. And an example that comes to me is when it's like Agatha is talking about how bleak February is, and it's all really serious and depressing, in her description. Like, we barely spoke, we did not smile, but then there's also this, not once did we clean the toilet on the second floor. And I just feel like it's just like this like subtle joke there, sort of, and I just wonder how you conceive of that in a book that I don't feel like it's main thing, that it's a book, it's not a satirical book, it's not a comedic novel, but it does have this really wonderful wit, and I just would love to hear how you think of that.
Yeah, thank you. I lean pretty hard on humor in my real life and in my writing life. I said that, I like to keep it fun for myself. And that's one of the ways that I keep it fun is like, chuckling while I come up with a funny detail or a funny situation. Yeah, I think there's so much about life that's like truly ridiculous. And like the fact that you have to clean a toilet when like, everyone's like clinically depressed in February and like can't really get out of bed. Like that's just so unfair and absurd.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm always trying to pay attention to those like little, mundane realities that don't really measure up to like the size of our existential grief or our existential despair. The fact that we have to like, be alive and also do these like disgusting, small, insulting things is like so universally unfair.
Yeah. You have such a good eye for that, like the absurdity in reality. Like you don't need to exaggerate it because you're just fine. You're just noticing it, what's already there, the absurdity.
Thank you. And I mean, so much of that comes from like, at least in this book, when I think really hard about religion from my like most cynical brain, I mean, I'm able to see like the beauty of a life spent in the church and a life spent devoting yourself to, these higher ideals. But then I'm also like, there's a man up there in more or less a dress who's like, who has been told that he has these superpowers of like transforming the bread into the body. Obviously, I would be excommunicated from the church today if I were still a member. But yeah, there's a lot that's like just truly wacky and absurd. And the church is kind of a natural source of that for me.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't even think about that as a particular, but of course, yeah, that
Right.
seems very relevant. So let's see. I think we're probably winding down. We may go to questions soon, but I have a few more things I'd love to ask you about. One is, I feel like, I mean, I'm glad that you read from the book because that gives people a sense of your wonderful sentences, and you're just kind of, I think of it as like a staccato musicality in your sentences.
Oh,
I
thank
just
you.
was curious, and maybe it might be too intuitive to really talk about, but I'm just curious, like how you think about your sentences and language. I mean, does it just come naturally, or do you read aloud? Like, where do you think that comes from, or what kind of attention? How do you think about it?
Yeah, a lot of it is intuitive, and like I feel like my best sentences come from a combination of instinct and then also like staring at them for a long time. So like trying to train my ear to hear clunkiness or weirdness or like distracting rhyming, for instance, in a sentence. It's taken a lot of practice, and I usually rely on like writers that I consider really skilled at using language and like producers of totally lush sentences as guides in that way. Like being honest about whether or not a sentence, would show up in a book of someone that I admire. Like that's one of the questions that I ask myself. Yeah, and that's something that I try to teach students as well, is like each word that you use has to be the best possible word for that purpose. Yeah, and so like, one of the things that I asked myself in writing this book was like, would nuns call it their period? Would they call it like their menses? Would they call it, like trying to decide like the exact right diction for all of these different situations. It takes a lot of work, and sometimes your first instincts aren't the right ones, but it's my favorite part of the process. Yeah.
And who, I would love to know, who are those writers, or what are those books that you like reach for when you feel like you want to sort of make sure that your language is really hitting?
Yeah, well, Karen Thompson Walker for one. For sure. I really loved Lydia Millett's The Children's Bible. I'm not sure if that's how you say her last name.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah. That was a really like shimmering book in my mind. Just beautiful, beautiful sentences. Right now I'm reading Christine Smallwood's Life of the Mind, and those sentences are totally different tonally than, like they're not lyrical. They're not like beautiful. There's like a lot of like really gross stuff in that book. But like very well constructed and very mindfully constructed. Yeah, and then I read a lot of poetry too, just to kind of like hear things differently and hear how other people see or describe the world.
Yeah. Great. And do you read your work aloud? It feels like that to me, but maybe you just hear it in your head.
Yeah, I do. It's a lot of muttering. If anyone were to ever watch me work, it would be like very concerning for them, I'm sure. It's a lot of like staring at the wall and then like chanting to myself. Yeah, so it's usually best if I'm in a locked room.
Well, the result is really lovely. And it's really one of the things that has stood out always, like since the first sentences of yours I read. So
thank you.
So I feel like we talked about checking for questions around 4:45 from the audience. So let me just see if we have any questions. Otherwise, I also have more questions. But go ahead and chime in if you do have any. Are you willing to talk about what you're working on next, Claire? That's one of my questions, or currently. Yeah. Or feel free to say no. I can't say anything about it.
It's so precarious. Trying to describe something is like, I could spend hours and still have nothing to show for it. I know that it involves the post office, which has long been a fascination of mine. Another institution that like I don't really get how it works. So interested in trying to figure out what role mail has in 2021 and beyond. And good. Also I think it involves a scam, because I was scammed.
Oh, really?
I fell for a scam. Yeah. Which no one is ever really that surprised.
Wait, did you say it's a mail related scam?
Yes. Yeah. So those are the two things that I know right now. That might change, in 48 hours, but
no, I feel like something about like switching to another institution, like you said, feels like
right.
Like, like I can imagine you being well suited to
it. Thank you.
Do you want to, like, to me from the outside, it feels like this publication is going really well, but I don't know, how has it been? What has it been like to publish a first book and to be sort of go from that time in the wilderness, to being out there and have strangers writing about your book and stuff? Like how has that experience been so far?
Whew, tiring. I took a nap today and I woke up from the nap and I was like very panicked. Like I was looking around like, where am I? What's happening? Yeah, I think that like even though I've been writing this book for years and felt very ready for it to be in the world, I don't think like I don't think I knew what it was like, or I don't think I could have prepared for just the weirdness of having other people come up with words to describe it.
Yeah.
Like a word that I keep seeing is quirky and charming, and I'm like, what? There's no charm here. Yeah, so so it's funny to like, we're both looking at the same things and we see or feel totally different things. It's been very yeah, it's been very humbling in that regard because I no
Yeah.
longer have any control over it or
Right.
any say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there have been like I don't know, like the things that jump out at people, have they been different than what was on your mind most?
I think when I can tell that someone like really got what I was going for, that's such a rewarding feeling and such like it's a little bit like falling in love or um, it's just a real triumph for someone to get that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and then I've gotten like a couple notes of like there's no Kroger's in New York State, or there's
Oh,
no like, like little things like that. My father, when he was reading some of my work, was like, there's no Arby's on Hamlet Avenue. And I was like, well, I put it there. There is now in this world. Um, yeah. So funny to see what people notice or are drawn to.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right. Um, so let me just check again if I don't see questions over here, but I hope that I'm not overlooking them. So, but maybe Megan will jump in if I am overlooking them, but I have like one more thing that I would love to ask you about if that's
Yeah.
okay with you, Claire.
I think no questions.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I skipped over one. Oh, um, yeah, I think this idea of I have to admit that it wasn't something I thought of on the reading, but then I saw it mentioned that you had an idea about structure that then really fascinated me, even though I feel like I feel bad that I wasn't attuned to it immediately, but I would love to hear you describe that and how you went into that. Do you know what I'm talking? I mean, the three.
Right. Yeah, the structuring part of novel writing is so hard and imperfect, as I'm sure you can relate. Uh, I had like big clumps of text and big clumps of narrative, and then, had to like shape it into some kind of narrative arc. And I broke the story into 3 parts because like a 3-part structure is, very reliable way to structure a book.
Uh-huh.
It's just tidy and, age old. So I broke it into 3 parts, and then I was kind of looking at like what really happened or what the heart of each section was, and it kind of announced itself to me without warning that the 3 vows that nuns take kind of corresponded to what was happening in each section, or what was like driving the main tension
Mm-hmm.
of the section. And it was like a little bit like a miracle, or like some kind of inexplicable circumstance. So a very happy discovery on my part. And then I kind of had to do some tweaking to make it a little bit more obvious why the poverty section is poverty, why chastity is chastity, obedience.
Uh-huh. That's
Yeah.
fascinating though that it predates. Like I was wondering if you had kind of come up with the idea of structuring.
Right.
But
Right.
it's fascinating that yeah.
Yeah, for a little bit I was considering like, what if there were 10 parts and each was like one of the 10 commandments? But that's not really yeah, no, it didn't work. So
I think that reminds me, we talked a little bit about write as you go to for sentences, but are there novels like as you were as a first time novelist, like as you were kind of figuring out how to write a book, how to write a novel length book, like were there books that were helpful in that sense that you went to, or was it sort of its own road?
Yeah, I relied pretty heavily on Afterbirth by Elisa Albert.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. That's a 3-part structure that I just really admired. It's very simple and clear cut, and like taught me a lot in terms of, you know, how do you ask questions at the beginning of a section that, you know, are different questions than the one in the previous section, but related. Like just, you know, in terms of following through on the promises that you make to the reader. That's something that's a book that, you know, blew me away in that regard.
Uh-huh. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great to know. Yeah, I definitely feel like just having a model of a book in mind, especially when it's maybe pretty different subject matter, but it has some resonance. I feel like the structural model can be really useful. So I'm
Yeah.
interested to know that you had that. And then I think I just have one last question, which I meant to ask you earlier, but if we have time, I think we have time. I think my last question is, you know, a lot of first novels end up being heavily autobiographical. Not all, but it's a common way. And so with this book, I was kind of fascinated with. I mean, I think you can choose. I'll sort of ask you 2 questions, and you can answer whichever one you want. But it's like I was fascinated by the fact that you wrote this novel that when you know you don't have this exact experience, as far as I knew, and I think that's right, that's true. But so I'm curious, like, does it in some way draw an autobiography in a different way, or if not really, then I'm just interested in some of hearing what your experience was like and what the challenges were of writing about people who were really in pretty different circumstances.
Yeah, it's a very not autobiographical book by design. I think when you and I first met, I was writing like I remember one story that you read that was like the whole plot was there was like a vague breakup. You know, there were just like a lot of stories about characters who were a lot like me, who were, you know, like vaguely lost and vaguely unsure of themselves. And yeah, I mean, I think like the conviction of a nun was very appealing and kind of mysterious to me when I was at this time in my life. And the idea that like you could be so certain about yourself and about the universe that you would like make this drastic decision.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted a little bit of that certainty, and I yeah, and I also wanted to like not write about 25-year-olds who
Yeah.
yeah, went to parties. Um so yeah, so it really appealed to me in that regard, and the idea that I hadn't um you know been in these exact situations, and these scenarios seem to like, I don't know, be really promising subject matter in terms of like answering my own questions and my own, you know, like little personal mysteries.
Uh, Great. That's very beautifully put.
Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. I think maybe can end on that note, but thank you
Yeah,
everyone for being here, and
it
thank
looks
you. I'm so glad that I got to do this.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. What a joy.
like yeah, it looks like we've reached the top of the hour, but thank you to Claire and Karen for joining us at Home with Literati. And a reminder to buy Claire's book. The link is in the chat. Take care, everyone.